the biggest hurdles to make the march happen were internal disunity and dissension, a lack of funds, certainly initially, a concern about the role of the government. Would it basically do what it said, or would it do something worse? I think, and turnout. I think those are concerns that were among the biggest hurdles. Because you could get the folk, you get the celebrities there, but will you get everybody else? And will you have an event that is going to change the way the country views itself from that day on?
Most people see the march, they see the glorious speech by Dr. King. As you mentioned, they don't see the effort that went into the coordination to get 250,000 people to Washington, D.C. I mean, that took a tremendous effort. That took a lot of work. And so I think people, aren't aware of the organization that went into pulling off a successful demonstration. I mean, there were so many things that could have gone wrong.
It is a two-step process. However, there is some experience. When Dr. King came to D.C. in 1957 and spoke at the Lincoln Memorial, this was the prayer pilgrimage. He had had a chance to sort of see in his mind what it would be like if he ever had to do it again. But the idea in 57, and the march took place around the time of the 3rd anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, was a lot different in 63. He had to corral conflicting egos the size of small buildings. So that first, before anything else happened, you had to get you had to bring in everybody, and I don't know how they did it. And to do this within the context of having your every movement reported on, bugs, wiretapping, and everything going back. So much so that they would go to meetings with the government officials, and the government officials would hint at what they had been talking about the night before. So when we get past this, bringing everybody together, doing this not surreptitiously, not as much as you'd like, or not much as people would think today, but doing this in the face of constant government surveillance, then we come in, and now that we have the leadership together, and we're essentially talking, by the time of the march, 10 people, 6 African Americans and 4 whites. Now you've got to get the money. And with the money, you can begin to expand your program and begin to help people come to the nation's capital.
They raised about $150,000, which, might not sound like a lot, but in 1963 was a considerable amount of money to raise $150,000. This button, they sold these for $1 each as a way, and before the march, they had sold about 75,000 of these buttons for the March on Washington.
This is where the advantage of pulling in this whole array of different organizations to support them was crucial. They really did work. The NAACP had just branches all across the country, so they recruited through that. The National Council for Negro Women was an early supporter with Dorothy Height at the leadership of it, so they advertised through that. Blacks fraternities and sororities were also endorsers. They did not get the endorsement of the AFL-CIO, which was still very riven with debates over the place of black workers. But the AFL-CIO gave them a lot of cash and also helped get the union representatives out. They had contacts in the churches. They had contacts with a variety of liberal groups. So they're really, putting the word out. They set up a headquarters in New York City. That's where Bayard Rustin's working out. They get, they're not afraid of the publicity, so they get coverage in the white newspaper, what I would call the white newspapers, but the newspapers that generally covered white activities and only occasionally covered black activities, they got, comprehensive endorsements from black newspapers, with only, one or two black newspapers saying, this is a bad idea. So they had all these ways. They were, using radio. They were, getting interviewed on TV. They were really using all the forms of mass media that were available to them at the time. They were also, on the streets at times in New York City. They had so much logistical stuff that they just had to figure out. When you look through, the records that Randolph left of his organizing for this, they're just dealing with everything, getting buses, ordered, figuring out how people are going to, the stars are going to get there from Hollywood, where they charter a plane. They're like so detail oriented that they're just making sure that, to the extent they can, that people are going to be able to get there and show up and take part.
You don't have social media. You have grassroots organization. Bayard Rustin, who was a veteran of the civil rights movement, who had been involved with the Montgomery bus boycott, but who unfortunately was smeared by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. Bayard Rustin, at one point in his youth, had been a member of the Young Communist League, and so that became something that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI sought to use against him and to use against Dr. King. So Bayard Rustin had to work in the background, as he did during the Montgomery bus boycott movement, 1955-56. But he was a brilliant tactician, and so Bayard Rustin was able to work out the logistics for the March on Washington.
They have, partly they had to decide actually on the style of the march. That's one of the first big decisions and that they're trying to figure out. Originally, when people were talking about this march, there were people were talking at times about civil disobedience at the Capitol as a way to force people into voting for the Civil Rights Bill. In the compromise that got Wilkins and the NAACP to endorse it, that had to go completely out the door. Indeed, in the discussions, one of the biggest places for the logistics was in working with the Kennedy administration, which ended up being as much a partner in this demonstration as the African American civil rights groups and the labor unions and the churches. The Kennedy administration was working with them a lot of the time, but working in a way to get things where they wanted them to be. And one of the things that quickly became apparent was they wanted the march to take place away from the Capitol and center it on the Lincoln Memorial as much as possible. And so that meant that the format of the march, to some people, became much more that people were to gather at the Washington Monument and then walk to the Lincoln Memorial. Now, as people who have walked the mall know, that's not actually that far. Rustin has such great lists. There's the sound system. There's who's going to speak. What order will they speak in? There's the question of where will the toilets be? What about first aid? What about the fear that it's Washington, D.C., it's August 28th. What happens if it turns out to be 100 degrees or 97 degrees and 150% humidity? All these levels of things he's figuring out. They're also facing the deep skepticism of the authorities of D.C. The D.C. government is by no means embracing the opportunity for this group of people to come to the district. So they pretty much say that everyone has to be out of the district by the end of the day. I mean, obviously people who could afford to get a hotel room and so forth, they could, but they really didn't want to end up with any situation of people camping beforehand or camping afterwards. And so Rustin's under this pressure to have people get down early enough and then leave early enough. So he's got a compressed time schedule.
I think that it's so easy to think that a moment like the March on Washington is just inspired by goodwill and people's desire for change, but all of these things cost money. Someone has to pay to charter a bus. Someone has to pay for accommodation. Someone has to pay for Josephine Baker to travel from Paris, right? That there's an element of the financial management of the march that we often elide because we want to believe that everything is about principle. And so when we start talking about the economics of agitating for change, I think sometimes we get a little skittish because we want it to all be moral goodwill. But when we look at different models in the movement, like the Montgomery bus boycott, and what people had to do financially in order to support private cars to avoid buses, what families had to sacrifice in order to support the boycott and maybe lose their jobs, we get this real deep appreciation for our contemporary conversations that are part of the Occupy movement about economic justice, or about who has the privilege to be a change agent when we look at the throngs of young people who are able to enter public service because they can afford it financially. And so I think that the most fascinating part of all of this, to me, is the accounting, the books.